Good evening, everyone. Everyone got really, really quiet, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Before we begin, we'll go to God in a word of prayer. If you would, please bow with me. Our righteous Father in heaven, we approach your throne of mercy and grace. Very thankful, Father, for the ability to be able to come and talk to you, for the ability to bring our petitions before you and to bring our cares before you, knowing that you not only listen to us, but you answer us, that you provide us the things that we have need of, that you give us the strength that we need when we need it, and that you provide us with wisdom and courage and everything that we need in this life. You have provided us with all spiritual blessings through your Son and our Savior, Jesus. We ask you, Father, to help us this evening. We ask you first and foremost to forgive us of any sins that we have against you, helping us, Father, that we can recognize those issues in our lives, and as we recognize those things, that we'll put them away, that we'll try to do our best to live in such a way that it would honor you. But Father, we also ask you as we enter into the study this evening that you would strengthen our minds, that you would strengthen our faith, that you would help us to grow closer to you as we know more about you, know more about your Son and the promises that you have given to us. We're mindful at this time, Father, of those who are not able to be out with us, that are not here because of physical reasons. We know that we have many that are struggling with their health, and we'd ask you to watch over them and give them strength as only you can. But just as important, Father, and more so, we're mindful of those who are struggling spiritually, and we hope and pray that something can be said or done for them that would help them in their life here, that they would be able to grow closer and turn back to you where they need to. Watch over us, be with us, Father. Help us always in our struggle in this life to be able to be acceptable in your sight. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so Alan and Brother Chris Travis finished up the study of the minor prophets. Our original intention was to study from the book of Ezekiel, but I was just talking with Alan about that. There was two reasons why we decided to kind of back up and not do that. One, they did a really good job of helping us understand that the minor prophets were not only trying to encourage the people that they were writing to, but there were many, many instances of where they kept trying to tell them, point your minds forward, point it forward. There's something else coming. There's someone else that's coming. The Messiah is coming. And so we thought it would be good, rather than taking a turn and going backwards to the book of Ezekiel, to move forward and to look into the Gospel of John. The second reason why we decided not to do the book of Ezekiel is because it's the book of Ezekiel and it's not easy. And so we punted, as it were, to another time. But we'll get to it sooner or later. So we have physical copies, a few physical copies of the Gospel of John, handouts that we're going to be following. You've been in enough classes, most of you have been in enough classes with Chris and I to realize that we will use that some, maybe, not much. But it's going to be used kind of as an outline, so that way we can know where we're going from one lesson to the other. We only have a few, though. We got toner coming, and we'll be able to make more by the end of the day, hopefully on Sunday, so we can get a physical copy from that. This evening, though, we're not even going into that material yet, because I thought it would be good for us to look at the time frame from where the book of Malachi ends and where the Gospels begin. Because there's some significant time frame inside of that, a little over 400 years, that are what some people call it the years of silence. And they're years of silence because there's nothing in God's written word about them. That's why they're silent. But as we think about that, as we open up the study this evening, I want to ask you a few questions. What was life like for the Jews as we end the Old Testament? As we're ending the Old Testament, what we're talking about here is the book of Malachi. We're talking about the time frame of Nehemiah and Ezra. They kind of were contemporaries, all of that. So what was it like for them? Where were they? What was their spiritual condition? What was their physical condition? What was it like?
Sorry about as good as it has been for a long time.
Okay. All right.
There's things wrong, but
Yes.
better than it has been for a while.
All right.
They had rebuilt the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Let it go some.
Yep.
They weren't falling on the walls like they were supposed to.
Yeah, when you look at the book of Malachi, you see that God is not pleased with them, right? From a spiritual standpoint, he says that I'd just about as soon not just about as soon, I'd soon that you'd close the door and not come in than to bring in what you're doing, right? So things weren't overly great there, right? Physically, they were back. Some of them, a very small portion of them, a remnant, were back in the city of Jerusalem, in the area around Jerusalem, a very small area around the city of Jerusalem. So it's not like they were, they weren't back to the land that they had during the time of David and Solomon and Hezekiah or Josiah, any of those, right? It was a real small area that they had come back to. So physically, things weren't going well. It's not like they were just overflowing with material abundance, because God said, you're not following after me. He said, if you would come after me, I'd open up the storehouses of heaven for you, right? So things weren't going overly great for them there. They were underneath the rule of foreign kingdoms, right? So, if you look at all those things, it's not great, right? Not great. Yes, sir.
Like they had, at least some of them had an expectation about the Messiah, although maybe they were looking at it in different ways. Some of them maybe looking at it morally or political or.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There was some indication they were looking forward to something, but probably not with the right idea, right? That's for sure. So very negligent in some of their worship, at least. Now, we're not talking about every single person. We understand that. We're talking in generalities, right? Small land and control right around the city of Jerusalem under the control of the Persians, and we'll get to that a little bit more in just a second. So remembering, again, what Alan and Chris were talking about, specifically when we studied the book of Amos, what was one of the things that God said was going to happen? Specifically, Amos chapter 8, like around verses 11 and 12. Like where he said, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land. What kind of famine were we looking for?
The Word of God.
Famine of the Word of God, right? That he wasn't going to talk to him anymore, right? The message associated with what God had been given to them through the prophets, he said, I'm going to cut it off. You're not going to hear from me. And so we know that that's coming, and that's exactly what does come here after the prophet Malachi. One more question for you as we kind of introduce this time period. Knowing what we've studied now in the minor prophets, where they were, the people that they have interacted with, the kingdoms, empires, all that kind of stuff, and then skipping forward in your mind to the time frame of when John the Baptist and Jesus are here, knowing the two differences, what are some of the differences? What are some of the people? What's different about the time frame? Some of the words or some of the people that didn't even cross the Jews' mind in the Old Testament that when you get to Jesus' time, they're prominent. Sadducees, Pharisees, Romans, Herodians, Greeks, John the Baptist, Samaritans, okay? At least in the way that they are in the New Testament, right? And back when they first went into captivity with the Assyrians, they were almost at war with each other, right? Very violent toward one another. Now, in the New Testament, they're still not friends, but they're not really, physically at war with one another. Anything else? Yep, Roman leaders. Synagogues, that's right. What about their position towards some of the law? What about, and some of this gets back to Sadducees and Pharisees, right? Underneath the Old Testament when we left it, and some of what was happening underneath Nehemiah, they found out, and also underneath Malachi and others, in the prophet Malachi. How did they treat the Sabbath day? They weren't holding it sacred, were they? They weren't following what they were supposed to, right? What about in the New Testament? How far had they gone?
Absolutely trying, what do people want to say, legalistically.
Yeah.
And even good.
That's right. So they went to the point of they weren't following the Sabbath, even to the point where we're saying, well, you can't do anything even good on the Sabbath, right? So it was totally different viewpoint. What are we trying to say here? There's something that happened. A lot must have happened between the time in which it ended with Malachi and the time in which Jesus and John come. There's a lot of things that must have happened because a lot of things changed, right? And knowing some of those things that changed will help us understand what's going on in the Gospels. Do you have something?
I was going to say, basically, the fulfillment of the book of Amos.
Yeah.
And the kingdom that were going to be, there were still some kingdoms
That's right. I'd actually thought about us going and looking at Daniel chapter 2 and the other 2 chapters at the end of Daniel, or 3 or 4 chapters there at the end of Daniel, but I decided against it because we wouldn't have time. We probably won't have time to do what we got, but we'll go as far as we can.
With no redirection from God, then we're just going where we want to go. You know, this is over 400 years. What one generation thought was law or was good, a generation later, who knows if they're keeping it or not. And the third generation, the fourth generation, it's just going where we want to go.
Yeah,
It's going where man wants it to go.
Yeah. If you don't have something to hold on to and a standard to go back to every time, we know just in our country we can see how far you go in 20 years, right? And the difference in the way that people think and what's considered acceptable and what's not acceptable in just a short amount of time. So as Keith is saying, you got 400 and 450 years here, and if they're not following a standard somewhere, then they can just go and be who knows where, right? Okay, so let's start with this, the Persian Empire. As we close the Old Testament, they are still in power, right? Remember, who was the first king, emperor, king really, of Persia when it comes into play with the Old Testament, with the Jews? Cyrus, okay? And what do we remember about Cyrus? What especially did he do?
Gave them the right to go back.
That's right. He fulfilled prophecy, a specific prophecy associated with Isaiah, where he was going to allow them to go back. Now, was it just the Jews that he allowed to go back? All people. That's right. Yeah. So his method was different from the Assyrians and the Babylonians, in which they would take the people from their homeland, take them and put them somewhere else. He was going the opposite direction. He was taking people and putting them back in their homeland, but it wasn't just out of the goodness of his heart. He was doing it for his own personal reasons, whether they could go back and maybe pray to their God for him, or because maybe they'd be more willing to pay taxes, or whatever the case is. We understand that it wasn't just, just out of the graciousness of his heart that he was going to let them go back, right? But Cyrus allowed them to go back, right? And we remember that as we go through there's a number of different kings that we go through. We go through the time of Nehemiah. We go through the time of Esther, who marries one of the kings. So all of that, we don't have time to go through all that. But as we close the Old Testament, there for the Persian leaders, we have Artaxerxes, Longomanus. By the way, I'm going to go ahead and tell you up front all these names. I'll apologize once that I don't pronounce them correctly. After that, just say he don't know what he's talking about, and that's fine. Okay. All right. So there's my apology for the one time. All right. So he reigned for about 40 years. He was the one during the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. After him came his son, Xerxes II. Didn't last long, only about 45 days, was assassinated by his half-brother, whose name was Sogdianus, something. He lasted a little bit longer, about 6 months, and he was killed by his half-brother. His half-brother's name was Darius II. Now, Darius II is one that we can remember. By this time, the Persian Empire, they've been in power now for over 100 years before. Now that before Malachi, and then about 100 years after that, they stay in power. But the empire is starting to decline, and it's getting in a pretty significant decline. Okay, pretty fast. At one time, they were ferocious, they were aggressive, they were militarily powerful. Now, instead of being like that, all of the people that they're going to have go to war with them, they're buying. They're buying mercenaries, so it's their money that they're using for their power and not their physical might. And so they get on a downward trend very fast. He had 2 sons, another Artaxerxes and a Cyrus. They were naming them after people in the past, if you can't tell. They were kind of fighting over power, who was going to come next. He chose Artaxerxes. This Artaxerxes, who went by Artaxerxes, M-N-E-M-O-N. I can't even try to pronounce that, because how do you do M-N-E-M-O-N? Anyway, by the way, what that means, this is free here for you. That's a word that means memory. He was known for having a great memory, and so they named him that. So I can do memory. I can't do that other word. So anyway, he reigns for quite a long time, but he's in battle with his own brother Cyrus over this time. During this time, Cyrus, his brother, hires some Greek mercenaries. You say, well, what difference does that make? Well, these Greeks start figuring out how weak Persia really is. So that's why it's a little bit of note there, okay? Anyway, after him comes his son, another Artaxerxes. This guy's name is Artaxerxes Ocus. During his reign of about 20 years or so, he has a kind of a resurgence of power, Persian influence, even so to the point that he goes down and he reconquers Egypt. Okay, so keeping in mind, you can see he goes back down here. They had lost kind of control over here. He goes back down to Egypt and gathers control over that once again. During this time, just again throwing out some words, he helps the king of Thrace. Thrace is over here. He helps Thrace against a guy that's coming to fight against him. Okay, and you say, well, what difference does that make? Well, that guy's name was Philip. He was Philip of Macedon. And we'll get to him in just a second. You may remember his name. If you don't remember his name, you'll definitely remember his son's name. Okay, so that's who this particular guy is. This, what did I say his name was? Artaxerxes Ocus. One of his generals didn't like him very much, couldn't control him any longer, so he assassinated him. Put his son in place. His son's name was something, didn't matter because it didn't last long because he didn't control him either, so he assassinated him too. Put the next guy in place, whose name was Darius III. This Darius III came into power the same year, 336 BC, that Philip of Macedon was assassinated. Okay? So he comes into power at the same time that we go to our next group, the Greek Empire. Okay? So the Greek Empire starts with Philip of Macedon. Again, around the 340s, 350 or so BC. Philip of Macedon, is the head of what's called the Hellenistic League or the Corinthian League. I saw both names. But they were a bunch of city-states in the area around Macedonia, if I'm a pointer, right here. That's where they started, okay? And their whole purpose in getting together, these Greek city-states decided to go up underneath Philip's rule and reign and leadership because they don't want the Persians there anymore, okay? And so they're going to fight back against the Persians, push back against them, and lo and behold, they assassinate Philip. And so it looks like it's going to fall apart. But who is it that takes his place? Alexander. Alexander is his son. Now, at this particular time, Alexander is 20 years old. Now, you need to remember a little bit about Alexander, okay? Alexander, from the very first part of his life, was diagnosed, as it were, as being somebody who had a lot of special talents. One man wrote that by any person's measure, he was a genius, okay? And so he was trained from very early on in life, not only intellectually, but he was trained physically, okay? So much so that, does anybody know who they hired to be his intellectual teacher? Close. Close. Aristotle. There we go. We get to him. Aristotle is the one that they hired as his teacher, okay? The Greek philosopher Aristotle. So he was very, very intelligent. They couldn't figure out when he was young what he was going to be because they describe him as being someone who is just someone that you walk upon and you just look at him and go, wow, look at that dude. I mean, he's just striking in terms of his looks. Said he was exceedingly strong, brilliant. I mean, he had every box checked, I guess, as it were, okay? But at 20 years old now, he has been kind of thrust into the leadership. And you think, boy, it could all fall apart in a hurry, couldn't it? As a matter of fact, some of the city-states kind of take that as an opportunity, saying, hey, now it's time to get out. But he acts very aggressively. He acts very decisively. He goes and he attacks and conquers one of the cities that's doing it. Its name is Thebes, Thebes. And because of that, all the rest of the city-states say, okay, no problem. And they unify underneath Alexander. Alexander takes that and very quickly begins to say, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to go out and conquer more. So I think it's around 334 or so BC. He takes about 35,000 of his troops and he crosses over the Hellespont, okay, which nowadays is called the Dardanelles. But what it is it's water that's between these two land masses that is the closest spot between the two land masses. So it's a geographical important place because that's where they could cross over. That's where the Persians had crossed over before coming this way when they tried to cross over and win the battle at Marathon, which they lost. But anyway, so he crosses over here with his 35,000 troops. And as soon as he crosses over here, he meets up with the Persian army. And the Persian army is giving him, well, they're ragging him. They're kind of saying, you know, you and your 35,000, what are you against us, right? That kind of thing. And being very impulsive and being young and brash, he just goes after him right then. He doesn't even collect his army or nothing. He just starts riding toward him. And his army follows him. And because of the way that he just went, the Persian army didn't do anything. And he conquered them, or he beat the army there. Darius III, remember he's the empire, or the emperor, the king here. He runs, he flees. And so, you know, it doesn't help, right? So what he does then, Alexander, he takes his army and he stays close to the Mediterranean, and he comes down around the shore, and he comes all the way around here to a town, Issus. Isis, I don't know, something like that, okay? Which is just north of where Antioch of Syria. We know Antioch, right? We've heard of Antioch. So it's just north of there. There he meets up with the army again, okay? And it's here, again, being way outnumbered, but because of their skill and their strategy and their bravery and because of their location, see, they got the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea on one side, doesn't matter. On one side, and on the other side, you got the mountains, so the battlefield is limited. So the great number that the Persians had wasn't an advantage because you could only get so many on the battlefield, okay? So they just rout them. It becomes a complete rout of the army there, okay? Again, Darius flees, though. So he doesn't capture Darius, but he's beat them twice now, okay? He goes on down. All of this is stuff you've probably heard in the past, but he goes on down a little bit further, and he goes to a city of Tyre. What is Tyre known for? What kind of a city is it? It's on the seaport, right? It's a coastal city, right? It's known because of its seafaring, right? It's a port for vessels to come into. And specifically for the Persians, they would bring vessels into there. You could get treasures, and it was very important to them, okay? So Alexander figures, if I'm going to control the sea and therefore control this whole area on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, I've got to capture this place. What was the problem with the city of Tyre by this time? It was on an island. See, the old city of Tyre, what we read about in the Old Testament, typically, it's on the coast, right? But now that's rubble, okay? And so now the city is actually out on an island. So what does Alexander decide he needs to do? Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to have to get out there to it because I can't just leave it. So he charges his engineers and say, you got to build me a road to get out there. Now, if the water had been really, really deep, they would have had no shot at it, right? But it wasn't. So they took all the rubble that was associated with the old city, piled it up, had a road about 200 yards wide, they say, that led all the way out to the city, and they took it. Okay? He was smart. He was brash, and he didn't mind asking his guys to do a lot of things. Okay? So he takes the city of Tyre. He keeps going. He goes on down now, all the way down through here to the area of Judea, right? And he goes on down into Egypt. He conquers Egypt down here. By the way, about the main thing I wanted to tell you about what he conquers in Egypt, he decides that there's a place there that he wants to build a city. What is he going to call that city? Alexandria, right? What's Alexandria and all of these cities? He does this in a lot of different places. We just happen to remember that one better. But he does that in all the places he goes and conquers. He chooses places where he's going to build cities. And what are these cities going to do? What are they going to be? He wants to build them, and they want to be just like they are in Macedonia, Greece, right? He wants them to be they're going to be Greek cities. They're going to teach the Greek language. They're going to teach Greek philosophies. They're going to teach everything about the Greek culture. Alexander is convinced that the Greek culture and the Greek language and all of that's associated with it, that it's the best the world has ever seen, and so therefore everyone should be doing it. Everyone. And so he's going to spread it everywhere he goes. So he chooses these cities to do that. All right, so he's got Alexandria. He determines by now that if I don't capture this Darius guy, I'm never going to be rid of the Persians totally. Okay? So he goes back up here somewhere around north of the Tigris River in Mesopotamia. They battle again. They're outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, but doesn't matter. They beat them anyways. Okay? One guy that I was reading compared it, he said, having Alexander and his men, they were a fighting machine by this time, okay? So he said it's kind of like having a group of varsity lettering football people who have been playing together for 3 years, going out on the field to play football against a bunch of guys you brought out of the stands. Because that's the kind of difference that you were talking about in terms of a trained military people versus just people that they threw out there, okay? So it didn't matter really in a lot of cases how much they were outnumbered, because strategy-wise and skill-wise, they were just that much better than everybody else. But because of that, he goes on over, he beats him here, he goes on over, he takes over some of these other places like Susa and Ecbatana and I forgot the other one, but the big cities of the Persians, and they take the treasures that are associated with it. Some have estimated that the treasures associated with the Persian Empire that he took was as much as 180,000 talents of gold. In our today's money, you can't count. It's way up there, okay? So the amount of money, the amount of treasures that were associated with it is just astronomical, okay? Now, one thing to note about him, he was very generous, too, along the way. The people, he helped some of the people in Jerusalem along the way. My son was even telling me this evening, and I remember it now that once he reminded me of it, that when he was in Jerusalem, they told him about all the prophecies that were associated with him when he was there, which is an interesting thing. But Darius III, when he conquered him, his wife and children, he didn't kill them. It wasn't uncommon for them just to kill them. No, he treated them very well. Matter of fact, some of them he gave a royal burial after they died. So he was very kind in some respects. But at the same time, he could turn around and just be absolutely cruel, right? He killed his own bodyguard. Just killed him. So he was brilliant and a little off his rocker at times, okay? But he wanted to keep on going. He got all the way over here to India, and his men finally said, had enough. Well, we don't want to go any further. I mean, we started over here, we've come down here, we've conquered all this over here. Time to go home, okay? Now, he's done all this in about 10 years. And you think, well, that's a lot of time. And it is. But think about all this land that they're having to, and they're not taking, they're not jumping in their Jeeps, and their tanks. They're walking. Some of them are riding on horses and stuff, but the main majority of it is walking, right? Yes, sir.
Did he have elephants by then, too?
They did. Yep.
Tanks, I guess.
Yep. Some of them, they had trained elephants associated with that. That'll come some more with the Romans and Maccabees and stuff here in a minute too. But yes, you're right. So war elephants, as it were. Yeah. So anyway, he kind of loses his oomph, whatever it is. Now that his guys say, we don't want to go any further, he goes back to Babylon. He's staying there, and he's developed a bad drinking habit. He's developed all sorts of other stuff. And there's different stories about how he contracted malaria, he got pneumonia, he got this, whatever it was he got a fever and he died. At the age of 32 years and 8 months, I think somebody said. I don't know how they calculated that, but be that as it may. Just under 33 years old, okay? Now, we all know Alexander the Great. We know the name. And yet, look at what he did in just a short amount of time and how much he accomplished in that amount of time, okay? But for us, and associated with the Jews, and I'm not going to get anywhere close to getting everything I got down, what, other than the Greek cities, what one big thing does he leave, his legacy leave, with regard to how it's going to affect the New Testament? Okay. Yeah, language. Why? Yeah. Right. And it becomes the language of the world, as it were, right? Everybody is going to speak Greek. Now, they may speak their other language too, but if you've got any kind of diplomatic, any kind of governmental, any kind of formal, they speak in Greek. They write in Greek. What else is associated with the Greek language? Yes, it's written in the New Testament. Yeah, it's very precise language too, right? Remember, we've talked about this, just the one example of, we use the word love, but how many Greek words we talk about or show up in the New Testament that all say love? Yeah, I mean, and that's just the ones that they use. There's other ones. So it's a very precise language, very precise.
It's also a dead language.
What's that?
It's also a dead language, so
Well,
it doesn't.
it is now. That's right. Yes. Yes, it is now. And so it doesn't change now, right? So, yes, sir.
Also made it easier for the Romans ultimately to capture the territory that they did. And you look at it in God's grand plan.
Yep.
The major impact that gives the gospel of the Great Commission.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, one man goes right along with that. It says, God thus provided a medium through which to communicate the story of the gospel to the masses of the people and to tell God's exact will in exact terms. Right? And so when we think about Galatians chapter 4 and he says, what? At the right time, at God's appointed time, right? In the fullness of time. Well, this is all stuff that's leading up to that. This is what God is preparing to bring this all about to happen. Okay? Okay, so Alexander dies. Who's his successor? You're right. That's exactly right. He didn't choose one. Okay? The only people that are associated with his family is his mother, Olympias, his wife, Roxana, and his son who hasn't been born yet. Okay? Now, his generals at the very first are going to say, well, we need to keep this empire alive for his heirs and all that. And guess what happens over time? Yeah, I want it. Envy, greed, whatever else, they start fighting over it. Okay? And so 20 years of kind of chaos. His mother is killed, his wife is killed, his child is killed. And these generals are battling back and forth. In the year 301 BC, they sign I didn't even get to all that, did I? They sign a treaty, and in this treaty, basically you have 4 kingdoms, okay? Hopefully you can see it here. You've got, up here you've got 1, 2, 3, big one, and then down here Egypt in the blue, which matches right there with the water. I don't know why they did that, but right there is the 4th one, okay? So basically you wind up having 4 kingdoms out of the one empire, okay? Now, 2 of these don't really have much to do with the Jews. These 2 over here, they don't really interact with the Jews very much, okay? But these 2 do, okay? So we'll start with the Egyptian kingdom down here. Does anybody remember what the line of rulers, what names they took? Starts with a P. Ptolemy, that's right. See, I was trying to trick you. Starts with a P, but you don't say the P, right? It's Ptolemies or Ptolemies, okay? So he was one of the generals. He was a very powerful general, actually. And his descendants then keep this area of Egypt for like the next 300 years. Cleopatra, by the way, comes from his family line. She was actually, we think of her as being Egyptian. She was actually Greek. And if you think about it that way, she came from a Greek family. But she was ruling over Egypt, okay? Anyway, that was for free too. I won't charge you for that one. So about 300 years. All of them were Ptolemies. You got Ptolemy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and all that kind of stuff, right? But one particular Ptolemy, he was Ptolemy Philadelphus or something of that nature, the same word that we use for Philadelphia. He did something especially important with regard to the Jews and with regard to even the New Testament. Anybody know what that is? Yes. He's the one that was really, really keen on building up Alexandria's library, which became, world renowned, right? One of the documents that they decided needed to be translated into Greek because of its philosophical, because of its importance to the people and things of that nature was the Old Testament scriptures. And so he had 70 or so scholars of the Hebrew language come down to Alexandria and translate the Old Testament into Greek. That translation is known as the Septuagint, okay? Septuagint meaning 70, okay? So it was either 70, 71, 72, somewhere around that area of people that did it, okay? Is the Septuagint something in its translation, was it accepted?
Jesus used it.
Jesus used it, that's right. Matter of fact, the great majority, I think, of the the quotations in the New Testament aren't from the Hebrew scriptures if you read them directly, but rather from the Septuagint translation of it. Because you say it reads a little bit different. Well, that's because the Greek would read a little bit different. So yes, that would be the answer to that. And it made it very important. Why? That you have it now in Greek. Yeah. Now everybody can read it. Not only can everybody, those that are not Jews as well, but even the Jews now, I mean, if you're not speaking Jew, because primarily the languages that have become the primary languages after the captivity was Aramaic, right? It was a kind of a version of the Babylonian, Persian, all their languages, it was a kind of a version of that, and Greek. So Hebrew was something that wasn't spoken all that common anymore, okay? But Greek, yes, they could read it, they could understand it. So it was very important. So that's what that particular Ptolemy did. I mentioned them first because they had the area of Judea, which, by the way, it goes from Judah to Judea with the Greek influence on the names. They had it first. But it wasn't really theirs to start with. It was supposed to be this one, which is Syria, the Syria version. You got Egypt and Syria. His name was Seleucus. I looked it up how to say it. Nicator. Nicator, I believe is how they said it. Nicator. It was supposed to be his. He kind of relinquished it to Ptolemy because he served underneath Ptolemy. And so he didn't argue about that particular area because it was kind of the buffer between the two. So he kind of let him have it. Well, it stayed that way for about 100 years. About 197, 198 BC, a guy by the name of Antiochus III, who is from the line of Seleucid kings, he takes it back. Okay? So now we're talking now about the Seleucid Empire, Syria. Okay? Antiochus III, he's warring, and I'm going to go flying through some of this, all right? So hang on, grip something, we're flying. He starts fighting against Egypt, and he starts fighting against Rome, okay? Well, that don't work out too well when you split your forces kind of like that, and so he was defeated by the Romans up here in a couple of different places, a couple of different times. I don't remember the names at the moment, but a couple of different places, a couple of different times. So much so that when he finally signed a treaty with them, he had to tell them that he wouldn't hire any more mercenaries. He had to give them most of his fleets. He had to give them all of his war elephants, blah, 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 a number of other things. And then the final thing was he had to pay an indemnity or a war fund of 15,000 gold talents. Well, that's important because that put his kingdom in debt, and it strapped him from that point forward. It was it guided a lot of the decisions that they made from that point forward, okay? So he stayed in power for another 10 years or so. By the way, they took his son, this is Antiochus III, they took his son Antiochus Epiphanes as a prisoner so that he would pay the debt, okay? They traded him out a little bit later for Demetrius, who was another son, and sent Antiochus Epiphanes packing. Well, Epiphanes came down, and he eventually becomes king in his father's place. Antiochus Epiphanes is important because of his interaction with the Jews. Okay? He goes down. He's trying to fight against Egypt down here. He's trying to do this. He's getting pressure from all sides. Rome is over here. He's still got to pay Rome money. The Parthians over here are gaining power. He's got pressure on every side. So he wants to go down here to Egypt and get money. Rome comes to him and says, you can't do that. And so he has to go back home. During this time, though, the political power in Judea, getting our Jews back in the thing here, is the high priest. It's no longer really a spiritual leadership, it's a political leadership. They become the political headship. Well, when Epiphanes comes into power, he has two brothers that are vying for it. One is more spiritually minded, one is more Hellenistic minded. By the way, when we say Hellenistic, what do we mean? Worldly, Greek culture, right? Willing to take on other people's culture, not so worried about being spiritually minded. So much so, by the way, the other guy, his name is John, and he gets the high priesthood because he promises to pay money. So he bribes his way into it, okay? But he doesn't last long because another guy comes along behind him and tells Epiphanes, I'll pay you more money. So he says, okay, well, then you can be it, okay? So you can see what happens when you do that kind of stuff. So We've got the high priest here. Epiphanes tries to go down to Egypt. They say, don't do that anymore. The people here, in the Jews, they think that Epiphanes is done for. And so this John that was thrown out, he had fled. He comes back, and that makes Epiphanes very mad. Okay? So we're going to end here, I guess. I don't know what we'll do. We'll do something. I can send something out. We'll do something. But when he comes back, he does a lot of things to hurt the Jews. Okay? He takes away Jerusalem as being a place of sacrifice. He tears down part of the wall around Jerusalem, builds a fortress there instead. He builds a temple an altar of Zeus inside the temple. He tries to force Jews, and does force Jews to eat pork. He tells them that they can't have the scriptures anymore. Anybody that's found with scriptures, not only did he burn the scriptures, but he would kill the people who had the scriptures. You can't circumcise your children anymore. If you circumcise your children, not only will you die, but we'll kill the child with you. It talks about them being crucified and then crucifying or hanging the baby over the top of them. Very, very cruel, cruel, cruel man. Okay? Because of this, he's trying to go around and he's trying to get the Jews then to offer up incense to Zeus. And he goes to this one particular guy, this guy by the name of Mattathias Hasmoneus, something to that effect. He goes to him and says, you need to offer up incense to Zeus. And guess what he says? Nope, not going to do it. So he goes and gets another Jew to do it. And instead of allowing him to do it, this Mattathias not only kills him, but kills the officer of Antiochus Epiphanes. Guess what that starts? Anybody? Anyone? The Maccabean revolt. Okay, we've heard about the Maccabees. Well, that's where it comes from. It starts here because of all of his oppression against the Jews, they revolt. Right? They revolt against it finally. This Mattathias doesn't last long. He was an aged man by this time. He only lasted about a year or so into it, but he gets his sons. He has 5 sons. He gets his sons to carry it on. He has one specific son that he appoints as the military leader. His name was Judas Maccabeus. Okay? He was called, his name was Judas Hasmoneus, but they gave him the name Maccabeus. Why? What does it mean? I know my brother-in-law knows because he said it the other day when I was talking to him about it. Hammer. It means hammer. They called him the hammer because of his aggressiveness and his military. He was a genius, militarily speaking. He took the small bands of Jews and just won every time. But it wasn't, they didn't go out into a field and line up and battle. It was guerrilla warfare. He says that the people would be amongst the other people during the day, and at night they'd attack them. And so they couldn't even figure out who was doing it. Okay? So over and over and over again they won. Finally, in 164 BC, Judas and his brothers take back over the city of Jerusalem, take back over the temple, cleanse it, get rid of all the other stuff out of the temple. And Syria, by this time, Antiochus Epiphanes he dies off for a number of other reasons. And they finally determined it's not worth fighting those guys anymore. Just let them be independent. And so they're independent from Syria now. And they'll stay that way for about 100 years underneath the Hasmonean rule until 63 BC when a guy by the name of Pompey, who is Pompey, who is a Roman general, comes in and takes over the city of Jerusalem. So we got 400 years of history just like that. Now, we still got a little bit more to go, but we'll figure out how to either give it to you next week or give it to you in something else. Most of what I said tonight is in these. If you want a copy, just say, hey, give me a copy. Now, this is my notes. Some of it's copied from other people. Some of it's just mine. So if you read it and go, what in the world is he saying? Sorry. It's just my notes. So, but you're welcome to a copy of it if you want it, okay? But we've got Herods to go through. We've got Pharisees, Sadducees, synagogues, all that other stuff. So there's a lot more stuff there that's in between that, again, I hope it helps you. It does me. It helps me to say, where were they? Now, what has led up to now? It helps to understand the culture and all the, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess the atmosphere that's associated with what's going on in the New Testament. So that you'll know here sometime where this Herod comes from and why he was such a pain for the Jews. At least part of the reason why he was such a pain for the Jews. Okay? Any questions before I let Jake buzz? You probably say, I don't even know what you said. Can you start all over again? And the answer is no. Okay. All right. Thank you for your attention.